going to allow about 1 minute for people to join the webinar before we get started. So please, if you're just joining our audience, please stand by and we will be starting the podcast, or excuse me, the webinar in about 1 minute. Hello, everyone. If you're just joining us, please stand by. We're going to start the webinar in about half a minute. We're just allowing a few more people to sign in. Thank you for joining us today. We'll give another about 15 seconds here, and then we'll get started. Thanks again for joining us today. And we're about 1 minute, we're going to get started. Everyone, thank you again for signing in and joining this webinar on permanent and safe labeling for reusable packaging. I'm your MC, Marty Mades. Your host today is Jason Brownell, and joining Jason as a special guest is Julie McGill, who is the Vice President of Supply Chain Strategy and Insights at Trustwell. The subject matter today is going to be discussing how polymer fusion labeling supports the supply chain for the food industry and fits into regulations such as FSMA 204. We do welcome questions from anybody in the audience today, so Jason and Julie can address those at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to your host, Jason Brownell.
Well, thank you, Marty. I really appreciate it, the introduction. And yeah, I'm going to be conscious of everybody's time and want to get through this as quickly as possible for everybody, but we do have a lot of information to share. And in order to kind of understand our technology, how it fits in with the supply chain, I do want to make sure that everybody understands the technology that we're actually bringing to the table. So we are specifically talking about the polyolefin family of plastics. So we're talking about like polyethylene and polypropylene. And these materials really are a challenge to try to label. And so there's some reasons for that. The first reason, or the first challenge that you're up against when talking about polyethylene and polypropylene, so I'm talking about like pallets, totes, containers, things like that. One of the biggest one is the fact that it's a very low surface energy material. Nothing wants to stick to it. In fact, if you have an adhesive type technology and you're trying to make it adhere to a surface, you want to make sure that it has higher surface energy characteristics. Now, when you look at polyethylene and polypropylene, they're coming in very low, around 30 dynes per centimeter, and that's just one way that you can measure surface energy. And you compare that to, say, Teflon, which is coming in at 18. You know, we coat our cookware, we coat molds, things like that with Teflon so that nothing sticks to it. So again, these are materials that are challenging to adhere to, and we don't adhere to it either, and I'll explain more in just a moment. The other thing is these types of materials, polyethylene, polypropylene, they're constantly expanding and contracting. And I always use the analogy, it's kind of like using an adhesive-based bandage and putting that over your knuckle. As long as you keep everything flat, everything's fine. As soon as you start flexing it, it has a tendency to want to delaminate. And then, of course, if you add moisture, think about like cleaning cycles and things like that that are happening in the supply chain. When you add moisture to the equation, now things definitely want to potentially delaminate. And then lastly, if you've ever seen like a vinyl sticker, for example, that has bubbles and blisters underneath it, that can be caused by outgassing. So again, these are challenging materials to adhere to. Now, I was saying before that we don't adhere to it either. What we are providing is a polymer-based label. The label itself is plastic and becomes part of the plastic part, which is why it's going to be there for the life of that tote or bin. And certainly people come to us for lots of various reasons. Brand recognition is one. Track and trace, that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today, you know, from serial numbers, barcodes, and this would could potentially also include labeling that goes along with that, like you're seeing here in this slide. And one thing that we are bringing to market and we are actively field testing is a fusible version of an RFID. And again, adhesive type systems are really a challenge in reusable packaging when it comes to polyethylene and polypropylene. So that's really the nature of what we're doing here. And as customers are gearing up, as Marty said, for FSMA 204, we want to make sure that people at least understand the technology and um, what can be done as far as labeling those type of materials. So again, I am certainly not the expert on FSMA 204, which is why I have a special guest today, and I would like to introduce Miss Julie McGill. Hi, Julie.
Hey, Jason, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely, and appreciate your expertise in this area. Can you tell us a little bit, about yourself and about Trustwell, kind of?
Yep. So Trustwell is the merger of two companies that a lot of folks are familiar with, and we complement each other very well. So it's the merger of Esha Research, which is our Genesis platform. Many folks are familiar with our nutritional labeling solution that creates nutrition fact panels, ingredient statements, allergens, and other key information that's needed for product labeling compliance around the globe. Um, the merger of Esha and Food Logic, the Food Logic side is the other side of the business. So supplier compliance, documentation, incident management, traceability, recalls. So it's a great combination of two parts of the supply chain, right? Very important when you're doing product concept and bringing those products to market. But there's a whole lot of things that have to happen behind the scenes. And so bringing these two platforms together in these two companies, in my role, I monitor regulations. We have a regulatory team that I work with, and we participate in industry work groups such as the Produce Traceability Initiative, Global Dialogue for Seafood Traceability, GS1, and other groups. Because that industry piece is so very important, right? As we're solving industry challenges, how can folks like Trustwell, and Polyfuse, right? How can we help companies with those business challenges? Prior to joining Trustwell, I was at GS1 US for over 16 years. I helped work with the food industry, creating standards for things like product identification and traceability, the global data synchronization network. So, I've got a lot of history on the standard side, but prior to that, I was at Coors Brewing Company in Golden, Colorado, which was a very fun place to work. Loved that company, had a great time. In
Sure.
Colorado, it was a beautiful place to go to work every day. But I worked on EDI and store level data capture. And so, as we all know, that data is so very important. And that ties into, what we're going to talk about today with FSMA 204.
Absolutely. Now, in searching for an expert like yourself, I actually watched a webinar and found you online where you were having a webinar with the FDA. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yep. And so as part of FSMA 204, one of the things that the FDA is trying to do is get the word out, right? They want to get the food industry educated. And so, we are doing that as well, right? Solution providers, associations, and even your trading partners, right, are helping to educate each other on this rule. And so we hosted a webinar in February where we brought the FDA in and talked about, hey, now that the rule's been in place for, over a year, what are some of the things that the FDA, what are some of the new tools and things that the FDA is bringing to industry stakeholders? And so we talked about, the tools that they have online, some new documentation and things like that. But the FDA is also going to be providing some training for industry. And so that's going to be
Great.
coming in early 2025. But they also are creating online tools. For example, part of FSMA 204 is that you have to submit traceability data to the FDA. They're creating online tools and portals for industry stakeholders to use. So we use that as an opportunity to both educate on the rule as well as give the audience a chance to ask questions And actually, that content's available online if folks would like to view that webinar. We've posted it on the Trustwell website.
Awesome. Well, great. Can you maybe touch a little bit on how companies are digitizing for FSMA 204?
Yes. So when we look at this slide is from Trustwell. And so lots of companies are trying to figure out, hey, I capture a lot of this data in my systems today, but a lot of those systems don't talk to each other. They're legacy systems, maybe they're homegrown tools and things like that. How do I bring all that information together? Because FSMA 204 requires record keeping across the supply chain. And so it might be a shipping event, it might be a harvest event, et cetera. And so our platform is an example of a tool that companies could use to capture and store that data that they need for FSMA 204, but also to be able to produce that data for the FDA in that sortable spreadsheet. And so our tool really takes you, we like to say from recipe to recall. Hopefully you never get to that recall piece, but that whole idea of the life cycle of a product, how can we make sure that we are capturing that enhanced traceability data so that we are compliant with 204? The other thing that I tell folks all the time is this, data is valuable, right? So it's not just being compliant with the rule. It's also how can I use that data within my own company to enhance my operations or streamline processes and things like that.
Sure, absolutely. Well, do we want to kind of jump into the rule itself?
Yep. I'll provide the audience with a high-level overview, and for the group, if you go to the FDA's website, if you type in, FDA FSMA 204, they have a host of materials, online videos, presentations, guidelines, et cetera, for companies to use, even tools that'll help you understand, is this item covered? Is my company exempt? So I encourage you to go to the FDA's website to learn more. High-level overview of the rule itself. Like I said, this is all about enhanced traceability record keeping. And the Food Safety Modernization Act, that has been in place since 2011. And we've been working on a number of parts of the rule, things like the beginning of the chain, groundwater controls, food safety protocols, and things like that. Now we're moving into kind of the back end chapters of FSMA, and traceability record keeping has always been a part of the Food Safety Modernization Act. And so at the end of 2022, they released the final rule, and the FDA defined a number of activities across our supply chain where we'll need to do that enhanced traceability record keeping. And that record keeping is for a list of designated foods. At one time, they were called high risk, but designated foods, and compliance for this is due in January of 2026. So for companies who are covered, if you need to do that record keeping, you'll need to be compliant by January of 2026. And if we could go to the next slide. I think Jason is frozen. All right. On that, let's see, is he coming back? Let's see if we've got him back here. So, as he's getting back online, so for the group, as the FDA looked at that list of high-risk items, they created something that's called their risk ranking model. And they looked at a number of different categories to define this. So things like the number of outbreaks, the severity of outbreaks, the number of illnesses, the likelihood of pathogens. And they have all of this information on their website so that companies can understand, what is the criteria for these different categories and how did these items, wind up on the list. The other thing that the FDA has indicated is that what we call the food traceability list will be reviewed and updated every 5 years. And so as companies, begin that record keeping in January of 2026, we know in 2031 that there may be updates. Items could be removed from the list, in which case you no longer have to do record keeping, but companies can also be added to the list. And the FDA will give you a runway of time, I believe it's 12 months, for you to begin record keeping for those new items that have been added to the list. And so with that, Jason, are you back with us? All right, let's see here. All right. So the next piece of this is, what are the things that are on that list? And so when we look at the items, yep.
Sorry about that. Jason's computer did cut out.
Okay.
We do have a couple of questions. Maybe we can actually.
Oh, good. Yeah, let's do that.
Those while we're waiting for Jason to sign
Yep.
in. So I just got myself back on stage here.
Sure.
Oh, looks like Jason might be signing back in here. Let's give him
Oh, I think I see his name.
Thanks to everybody in our audience for hanging in there.
I am.
Modern day
There you are.
Okay.
That was fun. Gone. I was. So let's see. I need to change some slides here probably for you, right?
Yeah, if you go to the next slide, that'd be great. So
You
real
got it.
high level overview. And the FDA made it pretty simple. If you manufacture, process, pack, or hold foods that are on that food traceability list, you are covered by the rule. There are some exceptions based on company size, how you go to market. So things like farmers markets where they sell direct to consumers, things like that. So you'll want to make sure that you understand, is your company covered by the rule? So if you go to the next slide.
You got it.
So the requirements themselves, I talked a little bit earlier about capturing and storing data. And so for companies who are covered by the rule, if you handle, if you manufacture, process, pack, or hold items that are on that food traceability list, then you are required to capture and maintain those records for 24 months. The FDA says that it can be on paper or electronic. For most companies, just the sheer volume of data, they are looking to digitize their records. And if the FDA requests the information from you, so if you are part of an investigation, they're asking that you provide that data to them in a sortable spreadsheet within 24 hours. And for many companies, data is spread across many different systems. And to be able to meet that requirement of pulling all that data together in one place is almost impossible. And especially, if some of your processes and systems are not digitized. And so companies are looking for solutions of, how do I leverage what I'm doing today? And how can I enhance that, perhaps working with your existing partners and maybe even bringing on another partner to help you with that data capture. As I talked about, their FDA looked at a number of activities across the supply chain, and they've identified 7 activities where this record keeping is required for compliance. And that is harvesting, cooling, and initial packing. These happen at the beginning of what we think of traditional agriculture, but also aquaculture. That first land-based receiver is specific to seafood, but then the back end transformation, that's when we are making products. So whether I'm taking whole head romaine, shredding it and putting it in a bag, and now I've transformed it from one product to another, or maybe I'm taking that romaine and I'm putting it into a salad kit and I'm combining it with other ingredients and creating a new product. And then shipping and receiving, right? We're all very familiar with those activities. The FDA is asking that folks capture this. It might seem a little duplicative for shipping and receiving, but sometimes things happen in supply chains, right? And trading partner data might be similar, but not the same. And so they're asking that parties collect this information. If you go to the next slide.
You got it.
So big picture, that food traceability list that I talked about should be no surprise with the risk ranking model that things like produce, seafood, soft cheeses, nut butters, shell eggs, ready to eat deli salads. Those are the big categories that are on this list. The other thing that I want to point out is that all fresh cut fruit and all fresh cut vegetables are on the list. So a real easy example is strawberries are not on this list. But if strawberries are cut up and put into a fruit salad, and then that fruit salad is being sold in the supply chain, those strawberries are now on the list because they're considered a fresh cut fruit. That's the same for things like pineapple, etc. But like cantaloupes are on the list. So cantaloupe is often found in a fresh cut fruit cup. Cantaloupes are on the list either way, right? Whether it's a whole cantaloupe or you cut it up. So make sure that you understand the format that you manage these products in. And also you'll notice under a number of items on this list, it might say fresh or fresh and frozen, refrigerated and frozen. So make sure that you understand what are the items on the FTL that you're handling, and in what format do you handle them?
Gotcha.
Yep. So if you go the next.
That's really interesting though. That
Yeah.
you brought up
Oh
the
yeah. Fresh cut
cut.
fruit and fresh cut vegetables is that's a blind spot for a lot of companies.
Yeah,
They
for
don't
sure.
realize that.
For sure.
So this image, the FDA has a number of supply chain where they've mapped out the supply chain. On the top, those balls are all the different actors. And then down below are all of those critical tracking events. What are those activities where that data needs to be collected? The other thing I'd like to point out on this slide is that oftentimes one company might represent 2, 3, maybe 4 of the roles on this. So if, for example, if I'm a produce supplier and I own the farm, I harvest and I process, do the initial packing, I might own the first 4 steps on this graphic. The same is true on the back end. Often grocers own their distribution centers. So they're the end of the chain as well as that distributor partner. So make sure that as you're not only understanding what do I carry, you want to make sure you understand what roles do you own. And so in this example, we've got, lettuce that's being harvested. You'll notice that on that initial packer, there's a little bump out with a star. That's where the traceability lot codes are assigned. So I've harvested that romaine. But then when it goes to the processor, they are going to receive the romaine, and if they shred it up and put it in bags, and now that's a new product that's moving through the supply chain, now I have a new product identifier and I have a new lot code, right? Because I might have commingled it with other romaine,
Right.
et cetera. And so as that new product's moving through the supply chain, that's what needs to be tracked from that point forward. So when you talk about that capture and store piece, that's, there's different activities you'll need to do that for. And then for those orange shipping bubbles at the bottom of the page, anytime a product is shipped, the rule says that you need to share the information about those FTL items, the lot codes, et cetera, with the next partner in the supply chain so that they're aware that they're receiving FTL items.
Sure.
Yep.
Well, that's great. I mean, that slide really is pretty telling.
It's yes. And we do a lot of this data sharing today, but for many, not at the lot level. And that's key here. Yep. So I put this together and it was Jason and I were preparing for this presentation. We talked about how, hey, that list on the left seems pretty short, right? There's 8 attributes there. Well, actually the data behind those attributes, it makes it a much more robust data set. And so this is the shipping record requirements, but you'll notice things like the location information or the product information. That includes a number of things, right? For produce, it's the product name. It could be the commodity, the variety, the country of origin and things like that. When we get into the location data, it's the address, the phone number, contact information, et cetera. And then there's attributes. Number 7 is something that I don't think any of us are trading today, which is traceability lot code source. Who assigned the lot code to those items? And as I talked about before, not only identifying that, but then sharing that information across supply chains. Companies are trying to figure out, how am I going to capture this and how am I going to pass that along across our supply chain? So they've got to enhance existing systems and also tools like EDI and things like that. Where do I put this data so that I can share it?
For sure. Got it.
Yep.
This is interesting stuff.
Oh yeah, and that's why the FDA gave companies 3 years to comply, right? They recognize that there's a lot of work. As I tell people all the time, FSMA 204 is a team effort, right? There's a lot of data that's shared today, and there's a lot of ways that we capture that data, but we're going to need to enhance those processes and systems in order to comply for 204. So the last thing I want to point out real quick is that anyone who's covered by the rule has to create a traceability plan. The traceability plan outlines how you comply with the rule, including how you maintain those records, where you store them, what the format is, how you identify items on the food traceability list. And that's a real good example of, if I'm at the end of the chain and I'm a grocer, there are some things that are real easy to identify, whole head romaine. But if that romaine is in a wrap or a salad kit and things like that, I'm going to need the supplier's help to understand what items are covered that they share with me, right? And nobody knows that better than the supplier who made or created that product. Some of the other things, if you do assign lot codes, that they're asking for information about how you do that, et cetera. And so if the FDA, if you're part of an investigation, they're not only going to ask you for that sortable spreadsheet, they're going to ask you for a copy of your traceability plan. So this is something you're going to want to have, just like any other audit with the FDA, right? You have your documentation in order.
Got it.
Yep. And so the last thing I want to point out to the group is the FDA, like I said, they're doing a lot of education and opportunities to speak with the industry. And so later this month, they're holding an online virtual meeting. This is tied into the new era of smarter food safety. And so the FDA wants to share information. Some of the topics that they're going to bring the industry stakeholders together to talk about are things like tech-enabled traceability and how do we do data sharing and things like that. Because for FSMA 204, the FDA, they cannot prescribe how we do this, right? So how you mark your packages, how you share that data. So it's up to trading partners and solution providers and industry stakeholders to collaborate to determine, what do I do today, right? Where are the gaps, and how do I put together solutions inside my own business and collaborating with my trading partners to prepare for this final rule.
Great.
So that's my last slide.
Great. Well, I tell you what, as we kind of wrap things up here, and then we're going to turn it over for a Q&A session,
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit about the future of Trustwell? Anything
Yep.
going on right now?
Sure. So a couple things. So number one, in 2024, this is a topic that you're going to hear at a lot of conferences. I've got a number of conference seasons starting to heat up, right? I'll be at the Food Safety Summit and GS1 and other conferences this year, and all of them are bringing in the FDA, bringing in industry partners to talk about FSMA 204, to talk about how they're approaching it. What does the rule entail, et cetera. So definitely, I think there's an opportunity for a lot of collaboration this year for partners to speak with each other and discuss, learn new ways, but also discuss how they're working on that. The other thing I will tell you is we're really starting to see an uptick in Dear Valued Supplier letters. So as companies are figuring out what they're doing, they're sending out their letters and to their trading partners. And what's been interesting is, as with any system that you're implementing, even though the compliance date is January 2026, a lot of partner letters that we're seeing right now are asking for compliance by June of 2025 because they want to make sure their systems work.
Sure.
The other thing that I will point out is that, companies like both of us, right? Like Trustwell is working with a number of companies like Polyfuse and Williad and others to provide solutions, right? So as companies are adopting technologies for, say, product identification and data capture and things like that, how can they leverage those tools and be able to capture and store that data that they need for FSMA 204 compliance.
Great, exciting. Well, thank you so much for being our guest today, and so much information. This is fantastic. I want to bring Mr. Marty back and see if we could field any questions for the audience.
Julie, great job dealing with our technical difficulty. You can tell this isn't the first podcast webinar you've ever been on. So,
thanks.
My apologies. I'm not sure what happened there.
Oh, we rolled with it. And very educational, especially the sections on the food traceability list and the critical tracking events. That was really educational. Jason, we do have some questions, but I think it would be helpful for the audience if you could just summarize how polymer fusion supports, the value proposition of what it was that Julie went over. What value proposition does Polyfuse provide with regards to what Julie spoke about?
Yeah, oftentimes when you look at containers for harvesting, for example, you have these, very large totes that things are going into. And it's important that the labeling that goes on there, whether, it's barcoding, serialization, as Julie said, they're not explaining exactly how you have to do it or how you have to necessarily mark it, if I understand that correctly, Julie. But again, having a labeling method that actually becomes part of the plastic part and that will be there for the life of that container is very important. And again, this is not just for containers, but for example, shipping pallets, for example. So again, the polymer or plastic label, for lack of a better term, melts into the surface of that plastic, so it's going to be there for the life of it. So that's very important to a lot of the customers we're working with as they gear up for FSMA 204.
Excellent. Thank you, Jason. As you would
Yes, sir.
expect, one of the first questions that has come up is, can those labels be made FDA compliant?
Absolutely, and we deal with this as an organization on a daily basis. There's a lot of different compliances in a lot of different industries, one of which being, can you make it FDA compliant? And the answer to that is absolutely we can.
Great. Another question, Jason, was what resources are available to answer questions? I go back to Julie's presentation and that food traceability list and critical tracking events, but what resources are available to help answer questions for anybody in the audience who might want more information?
Yeah, I'm going to let Julie field that one.
Absolutely. So the FDA, like I said at the beginning of the presentation, they have a wealth of information on their website. As they have been getting stakeholder feedback, they've been enhancing their website. So for example, their tools are available in, I think it's 5 or 6 languages now. They have webinar recordings from all of their public meetings. They have added new supply chain examples. They now have examples of traceability plans. They have a new dedicated web page on the assignment of lot codes. And so even though they don't tell you here's how you should do it, they explain what should be in your traceability lot code so that it is a unique identifier that folks can use, right? So we can do our tracking and things like that. The other thing is on the FDA's 204 landing page, they have something called the Technical Assistance Network, the TAN. And that is when you click on that, it says, how would you like to contact the FDA? And it's like, I'd like to have a meeting. I have a question, etc. So if you submit, for example, a question online, I usually get answers in about 2 weeks. And so you can put in, because some parts of 204 are a little bit gray, right? And companies are and users are meant to interpret that. But if you ask a question of the FDA, they often will point you to, here's the section that you need to read, or here's an FAQ that we've created to address that. So I encourage folks to check out the FDA's website.
That's great. And when you were talking about the traceability plan and that they give you examples,
Yeah.
I'm sure that would be a daunting task to try to put together that plan. So having some examples is fantastic.
Yes.
Really helpful information.
For sure.
Jason, this next question, it's kind of a dual question to expand on what you just talked about with polymer fusion. The question is, what is the application equipment required, and can you apply the polymer fusion label to a curved surface?
Curved surfaces can be challenging for sure, but not in a single curve environment. When you start to get into compound curves, that's when it becomes an issue. And so I'll explain. It's also relative to the size of whatever label you're trying to put on it, and then the relation of that to the curvature. So for example, if you were to take a basketball and you were to try to take a piece of paper 1 inch by 1 inch and lay it on the basketball, pretty simple task. But if you were to take a piece of 10 inch by 10 inch paper and try to put that on a basketball, it's going to be full of wrinkles. So compound curves can be challenging, but certainly single curves are not necessarily an issue. As far as the equipment that is involved, there's lots of different methods for applying our plastic label or a polymer fusion label. This can be something that is a manual process for somebody that has maybe legacy items or low volumes. This can be done at a manufacturer's level where you have brand new containers that are coming out. So bottom line is the reason why the label becomes part of the plastic is due to heat. We have methods for applying barcodes, serialization, things like that, where the heat source can be put on with a shrink wrap torch, for example. But then there's also what's called hot stamping machines that have hot dyes associated with them. So there's a lot of different solutions for getting the heat to the surface of that plastic. And we are a company of continuous improvement, so we're always trying to improve upon various parts of our company, and one of those areas is the application process. So again, it's about getting heat to the label and to the plastic part, and then once they reach their melt temperature, those two fuse together, which is why it's there for the life of the part. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, there's more questions coming in, Jason. I think this next one is for Julie. I'm just going to read it back as it was written in here. It says, what are industry groups focused on right now?
So industry groups right now are focused. There are a number of associations and industry groups that have FSMA 204 steering committees, FSMA 204 work groups, et cetera. And even with inside stakeholder organizations, right? They've assembled FSMA 204 teams, right? Owners across their business. But essentially those groups are putting together guidelines. They're putting together educational webinars and other opportunities to get the word out. And so a great example is at GS1 US, just last month, they released an update to the EDI guideline for the advanced ship notice, which is an ASN. And in that, they identified fields that can be used in any ASN. So EDI has different versions. So like we're on version 8010 right now, but if you go back to like 1995, we were on 4010. All of those versions have shared fields. And so they identified fields where we could put that traceability lot code source, for example, and the traceability lot code source reference. So the nice thing is, when we talk about FSMA 204 compliance, most of these industry groups are talking about how do we use standards to capture this data for the different data fields, et cetera, because then we can enable integrations and we can enable interoperability, right? And that's going to be key when we talk about that data sharing. So back to the whole piece with the EDI, now instead of, everybody's just putting it in, some random field, we've got standardized fields for all the attributes for those shipping events. So lots of companies use EDI today. And so making sure that that message had all the attributes for FSMA 204 data capture. And then for the new attributes that were brand new to all of us, where can we put those? So we've got a standardized data field and we can, capture and share that data.
Excellent. This question just came in. This is a really good one. It's from someone in our audience who's talking about food safety concern, because obviously FSMA is talking about traceability, but they want to expand on their use of traditional labeling methods, Jason and or Julie, like an adhesive-based method, and what food safety concerns there might be with regards to use of that label that's a traditional labeling method.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and at least start with that.
Sure.
And we see that in a lot of different industries. Take, for example, in the medical industry where you're wanting to have clean surfaces. When you have an adhesive-based labeling system, if there's any sort of delamination that is taking place, now you have kind of this adhesive layer that may be still on the plastic part, which that can harbor bacteria and viruses and things like that. So I would say for reusable packaging, you could be in the same situation where if you have labels that have been partially removed and you still have adhesive there, that could certainly be a concern just due to the construction of traditional labeling methods. Julie, anything you would like to add to that?
Yeah, so a good example is the Produce Traceability Initiative, PTI, back in 2009. In the early 2000s, there were a number of outbreaks, spinach, cantaloupes, et cetera, that really hurt. Just decimated the spinach industry, for example. And the produce industry came together and said, we need to standardize the way that we identify products and the way that we label them. So they created what they call the PTI label, and essentially it's a standardized label format. It has a GS1128 barcode, and there are 3 components that they put into that barcode saying we need this for basic traceability. And it was the GTIN, which is the global trade item number. It is the date, and then the lot code. And so those 3 components tied to product data and location data, right, can give me that picture of not only that it's, hey, I've got this case of lettuce, but I know exactly what lot this is from, right? So in the event of a
Sure.
recall or withdrawal, I've got that information. So when we go back to that whole labeling piece, whatever, is it in a case, in a tote, is it, in a bin, but that label will help me as that item is moving through the supply chain, and then partners like yourselves, your labeling partner help you understand, what's the right container for these different products, what's the right label, etc. But having that human readable information on there, as well as a barcode, a 2D code, an RFID tag, so that I can capture the data electronically. That's what their goal was with PTI, right? Is we need to use advanced identifiers so that we have more granular information about those
And
purchases.
Julie, in your experience, are those labels traditionally constructed as just a sticker?
It depends. It depends on what the format is that I'm using for the, often on Corrugate, they are using a label that's a sticker, right? GS1128s don't read real well on Corrugate just because of the saturation of the boxes and things like that. However, there's, there are newer boxes and things like that work better, and some folks are able to do direct print. But big picture, again, it depends on, like I said, we've got all those different categories, seafood, etc. When I've got a whole fish, I'm tagging it and identifying it very differently than putting a sticker on a box, right? Those are those are 2 very different, whole tuna and a box of, tuna salad, 2 very different things.
Absolutely.
Jason, another question here, wanting us, or you, if you could, to expand on the barcode symbology and the abilities for polymer fusion labeling to print barcodes and QR codes.
Sure. Julie's kind of touched on that. GS1128 is a very common symbology. We see a lot of people that are utilizing 2D data matrices. We see people that are utilizing, unique QRs. So again, it comes down to the systems that they have in-house, the type of scanners that they want to utilize. Would you agree with that, Julie?
Yeah, what we're kind of in an inflection point right now where, you've still got folks that are on legacy systems where they might not have optical scanners. And so often we're seeing both the QR code on the same label with a GS1128 label, because folks might have one or the other. And with at the consumer unit level, there's something coming in 2027. It's called Sunrise 2027, where we're moving away from the UPC and moving to a 2D code. And same thing applies there, right? We need a standard so that all point of sale systems can read those codes. But the opportunity is to not just have that item number, but you can now add lot codes and manufacturer information, and you can tie into consumer experience and all these things. And so, the use of these codes, like you said, Jason, GS1128 has been the workhorse of the industry for, a long time, and rightly so, right? That was the technology that met that was the solution that met the technology and the capabilities of the time. But
Sure.
as things have been evolving, companies have been exploring other options. Now, I will say, even folks who use RFID today, and there are companies out there that are using it in production, in their stores, in their restaurants. You still have to put a label on there with human readable information, et cetera, because some partners in your supply chain may not be RFID enabled yet. So they need to be able to read a 128, whereas the restaurant, it's passing through those RFID readers. So
Great point.
we're kind of in that hybrid, place right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
One looks like there's actually another question that's just come up here, but one that came in before that was, The slide deck that you used, Julie, which talked about the food traceability list and then critical tracking events, is that available? Are we going to make that available for people to access after the webinar? Because they could go back and watch the webinar, but is that information
Right.
available for download?
Yeah, Jason, I don't know where, would you put that on your website?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly something that we could provide the audience if you're comfortable with that.
Yeah.
Excellent. And then one last question, just with the topic of RFID, is there a polymer fusion RFID label?
Yeah, I kind of touched on it a little bit during the presentation that we've seen a real gap in the reusable packaging industry, and we are currently field testing a polymer fusion version of an RFID. It's currently it is an Impinj Monza 6P chip, so this is something that is rewritable as well. But again, you're cooking or fusing that RFID into the surface of the plastic. So this is something that we're actively field testing right now.
If someone's interested on that, they can reach out to you, Jason, directly, I assume. Yeah.
Absolutely. Happy to help any way I can.
Yeah, those were all the questions, but what an educational event this one has been. Really great job, Julie. Excellent information.
Thanks. Happy to do it. And yeah, it definitely, for everyone that has joined us today, FSMA 204, like I said, it's all about education and quite frankly, a lot of collaboration right now. So we encourage you to, reach out to Jason and myself, as well as your industry partners and your customers, right? To understand, what direction that they're taking, what their expectations are, and how you can get ready for the rule.
Well, thank you so much, Julie. Really, thank you.
Yeah, great job, Jason. Julie, you've been a wonderful guest. Thank you.
Great.
Right. Thanks so much.
We'll go ahead and sign off, and everybody have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. This concludes the event. Thank you so much. Have a good day, everybody.